I lost you a little bit there again, but that's okay. I think, you're talking about kind of that game jammy philosophy, and I think that's an interesting way to put it, because you end up seeing that, I think, too, um, in the games themselves, and kind of what they are now, how it went from Little Big Planet to now Dreams, which is very much um, about that kind of collaborative philosophy. It's interesting to see, to hear you talk about the studio in that light, and then kind of see the ways that it does trickle out into the games that they're making, which is very, very cool. And then you go your own way, though, which is, I guess, brings its own new sets of freedoms, but also worries, which I can't imagine. So I've done like contract work for smaller studios like that, but I've never had skin in the game, in the sense of, I was never a full-time employee at a small place, or I never branched out with people to do that. So that must be a really kind of big move.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. Like, I guess my background was much more. So my first studio that I worked at was Insomniac, and that was a studio that shipped a game every single year, same time of the year. Review scores were expected to be a certain level, sales were expected to be a certain level. So going into somewhere like Media Molecule was kind of really eye-opening, because it was very like fluid, and it felt like there were no deadlines, and people were just like, it was much less about what are our limited resources and what can we do with them, and much more about like, what could we do if we had infinite resources. So it was like a really big change for me. So when it came to forming our own studio, I think it actually made a really nice balance at Media Molecule, that you had some people that were from Insomniac or Criterion who, would ship titles every year, and then people that were from Lionhead that were much more experimental and really exploratory. And so that microcosm kind of repeated itself with Foam Sword, where I felt like, Rex was really trying to think about what is the vision, what is the thing that he's really trying to get across, and how far can he take, the kinds of things that we're doing within Unity and within the amount of time and budget that we have, where, I'm very much like, we need to get this thing done. How do we scope it down? How do we actually, find ways to execute all the work that we need to do with just two people? So yeah, definitely once you get out on your own and all that stress is on you, and you have to be watching like, well, this is our company bank account, and this is it ticking down to zero.
I can't imagine.
And yeah. So I mean, obviously we're glad that we had like the help of Double Fine, who I think, because they've been through it so many times, could give us a lot of advice and tell us that, we could calm down at times. But yeah, I think the thing about when you start running your own company, you just never really get a chance to switch off. And I think probably even now, I don't know if either of us have really properly got a chance to switch off nights and bikes. Like I got, a bug report last night, and I was just like, oh, it's 3 a.m. My child just woke up, so I'm going to put him back to sleep. And then I might as well, try and repro this and see if I can get a quick fix out to him, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think especially when you don't have as many opportunities to delegate, I suppose, right? The feeling is that you just take all of that in upon yourself and take care of it. I imagine it can feel like constantly, right, when you're working at that kind of level of scope in terms of how many people you have, right? The idea that you see that bug report and you hop in and try and fix it almost essentially then. I mean, that's admirable and awesome, but it's also this thing where the work becomes maybe a little bit more present even than it was before.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the experience that I've had. I mean, obviously, the good thing is that the number of bug reports now is probably like, I don't know, one every couple months or something like that. So it's definitely calmed down since, when we launched about a year ago. But yeah, I think, just knowing, especially between me and Rex, one of the nice things is there's very little overlap between responsibilities. So it's usually a pretty clear case of like who has to deal with something when it comes in.
Yes.
But yeah, beyond the two of us, we don't really have anyone else to delegate to. So it's always going to be whatever's happening with the game. One of us is going to have to pick stuff up.
How do you both, when you're heading off to set up, foam sword. Where does the idea for Knights and Bikes initially come from? Because I think in some ways that like there's that universal sense of like just tapping into childhood experiences, but I'd be curious to know kind of how that project started off, where how it got off the ground.
Well, I think the initial thought really was making a kind of party management game that was very influenced by the Goonies, that awesome movie.
Yes.
I mean, it's. I mean, maybe everyone's getting older now. Maybe it isn't such a cultural touchstone, but it certainly is to like it was for both of us. And if we mention the word the words the Goonies to anyone, they would respond in some way. So it's quite a useful jumping off point. And I think that movie's so great because it's so simple and it's very focused, and it's all about the kids and their relationships, and and it sort of takes you back to a time when you first saw it, or even if you're a bit younger, then it's just you just enjoy like thinking about being a kid again and all of those like child relationships. So that was kind of the starting point. There was no way that we would go like license the movie.
Yeah, of course.
So we wouldn't have had the funds, and it wouldn't have been as interesting either. So we reset where it was based. There was some like sort of slightly duller business reasons that you get some help from the UK government if you're sort of
sure,
like setting things in the UK. So
like filming in the right city.
Yeah, exactly.
Almost.
Yeah. So I mean that was something to consider. But also at that point I'd never been to Oregon, or it is Oregon, isn't it? So yeah. So I mean I didn't feel that personally I could really add too much, like visually, or I don't know. I was worried that we'd end up like making a pastiche of something else rather than having any like original elements. So the setting of the game got switched from West Coast USA to Southwest Coast UK. Yeah, which is an area that I'm from. It's actually where I am at the moment because I'm on vacation.
That's right.
Yeah, so I've just come back from a walk on the cliffs, and
it's right outside.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And it's really a really beautiful area. It's got a lot of history. It's just up the road is where a place called Tintagel, which is where King Arthur's castle is supposed to be, and there is a ruin of a castle there. And yeah, there's just lots of like folklore and interesting stuff in the past, but it's also quite a financially challenged area. It's one of the poorest areas in Europe, so it felt that we could add some depth to the story there. So yeah, I mean obviously it sort of took lots of different twists and turns along the way with gameplay like switches. Where some of the early prototypes that myself and Moo were working on had like turn-based combat and things like that, but right. We were like trying to feel out what kind of game it would be, but fairly early on we knew that it was going to be this kind of childhood holiday simulator sort of thing, where you would just jump on your bike and tear off into the woods and make friends with a new friend and get involved in some kind of historic legends and and bring in a lot of like childhood energy and imagination and all of those good elements that when you're a kid you go off into the woods and you either have an adventure or you pretend you're having an adventure.
I think I think there's portions of that it feels really clear, that sort of intersection between kind of like the mundane and then something that feels a little bit more magical, because I think of, it's very early on, if I recall correctly, the treasured bunker with that giant funny like king just inside of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of running off with your friend to go on what is essentially like a literal treasure hunt, right? Except you're looking around and you grab, what is it? I think in that room you also grab like the disc that you throw around too. Yeah. And the idea that becomes almost like you're like a weapon on that quest. Right. I think it taps it. Not but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Just these things that you find along the way.
Yeah. Well, I think something that we latched onto was the fact that what was kind of interesting about the setting is that it's a very tourist-focused location. Mm-hmm. So you have the real legends, but you also have the fake legends for tourists. And weirdly, I mean, even though I'm, grew up in this completely rural English, or Cornish, I should say, area, I had an American Wild West theme park, like next to my parents' farm.
Really?
So, that was kind of that kind of had a bit of an influence. And I know, Moo grew up right next to Disneyland as well. So we both had this, we'd both been in close proximity to like fake realities. And, that's kind of what video games are as well. So it felt that we could have some fun with that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that in terms of some of the places that you end up going in the game, especially. I guess also because you were talking about kind of your early ideas for this and party management and things like that. I was curious, how early on did you really hone in on the fact that this was a co-op game?
I think it was definitely something that was always in my mind, and it's something that I've always strived for when I'm making games. I definitely think of two distinct periods of playing games in my life, and one was when I was a relatively young kid, and playing games meant going over to someone's house and playing something with them, whether it was a single screen multiplayer game, Smash Brothers didn't exist back then, but whatever the equivalent of Smash Brothers was back then, but it's I guess a Blast Chamber or something like that. And then I played a lot of single player 100-hour quest RPG games, and I just felt that when I was playing those 100-hour RPGs, I felt like I had to make a choice between either being social and making friends or playing games. And I really didn't like that. And so when I moved to the UK, I was like, well, I'm kind of going to reboot things. I'm going to try and play less of those games and more co-op games. And I realized very quickly that the games that I really enjoyed were the ones that I could play with my girlfriend at the time and now wife.
Right.
And so it was just something that's always on my mind of any game that I'm working on, if there is a way to make it something that brings people together physically, it's something I really, really want to emphasize. So I think when we did a few more prototypes on Knights and Bikes, I think that just sort of naturally came out of it, of just the idea of a gang of kids would always feel better to play if you could, have a gang of kids actually playing that.
Right.
And as time went on, I think we sort of cut down the number of playable characters and eventually settled on the relationship between Nessa and Demelza. And we had, the extra cast members, but we decided that the best balance between making a game with tons and tons of characters or a few characters that we could really dig deep into, we preferred the latter route. And so that's how it ended up being a 2-player co-op game.
I'm trying to think of these other characters that end up showing up, weird party members that also show up too. So I think of what was it, the Pickled Knight?
Yeah.
Just kind of following you around and things like that. I guess that's where you're talking about this notion of other party members that might show up, but you really do focus mostly just on the two main characters. I guess this sounds like a very random question, but this is on my brain because I'm also thinking of other folk in the game, and I think of, was it the goose? Is it goose?
Yeah.
What
Captain
is up?
Honkers.
What is up with like British games and goose and geese?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, they certainly have become quite popular. There were no other geese games when we added our goose. I mean, I was basically, we were, I think when I was maybe building out the caravan part level, I was trying to, think about, this is one of the characters, like their actual home where they live with their family, and it felt that they needed some kind of like guard dog, but we didn't really want to have a guard dog. Dogs are hard to animate. So,
well, I mean, at least we're being honest, right?
But also, something a bit more unusual and charming and what have you. And, we both got some experiences with ducks and geese in our backgrounds.
Yes.
And I definitely remember a lot of neighbouring families having a lot of geese, that you'd hear them all squawking if you went to visit. So we added a whole bunch of geese, and Moo added all the coding so that they would, all behave like real geese. And I think at some point there was just this thing of like upgrading one of them to become, special. And this became Captain Honkers, who, I mean, to be honest, looks exactly like all the other geese.
Yes.
Well, except if you're a backer, because he wears a little pirate hat. But we did a special thing for our Kickstarter backers. But yeah, I mean, just a regular goose. But yeah, I mean, it's a fun character to go on an adventure with. It felt that the kids are going to be talking a lot and interacting with each other, and it was kind of fun to just have a character that can't talk. I mean, they can honk, but they can't actually like really join in, but they're kind of a silent observer of everything else that's going on. And our goose is a nice goose, I have to say. It's not one of those dicks that steals everyone's sandwiches and drops them in a nearby lake or anything. So they're kind of a helpful character, and we found when we took the game to events that players would pet the goose, and they'd really like tend to the goose. And I know Moo's had like so many bugs that were thrown up because people would just pet the goose at the worst time. They're just in the middle of a boss fight and they're like, yeah, I'm going to pet the goose now. But it was kind of nice to just have this character that's coming along for the ride throughout the whole game.
Yeah, it's kind of nice to have a little mascot, right? It kind of completes the party in a very nice way. I think of that obviously because of Goose Game and things like that, but it's just for something about that feels very quaint, but also not in a bad way, right? In a way that feels very much like there's this part of me that sees just kids who just would have a goose somehow. Like I believe it entirely, which is very, very cool.
I think it's like halfway between, it's you've got the kids all doing their thing, but there was also in the 80s and maybe 90s, there's quite a lot of movies where animals would just team up and go on an adventure together. So it's kind of like halfway between those. We remember all the movies with the kids teaming up. We remember all the movies with the animals teaming up, and now we've just put them together. I mean, also there's a rotting like knight's
there's
head
hopping
hopping around with you. I don't know where
I
have no idea where he comes from. There's no there's no lineage to why he's in the group, but
I feel like that's an interesting mixture of, right, like there's something quaint and wholesome about the goose, and then it's just juxtaposed with that kind of what you're saying before, this difference between maybe actual local legend and what's being presented.
I mean, it's like a sort of sliding scale of
Yeah.
You know, like when you have a pet, you give the pet loads of personality. You know, you project that onto the animal, whether they've got it or not. You imagine them being like this amazing pirate, even though they're a goose. But you know, by the time you get to the late stage of the game, where the kids are imagining all this stuff, their heads are like full of all of these myths and legends. Then that's the kind of time where the pickled head of a once mighty knight, you know, kind of fits in with their whole world view, because you know everything is possible by that point in the story.
Right, like late in the game, you're in rooms full of flaming swords and all sorts of things that by any rights in a real space, it's just like, kids, you should leave. But instead you have your night buddy, you have your goose, you have your disc. It's all very, very good. I like that balance. I like that balance in the sense that there's a nice sense of growth, right? I think in the game, in terms of starting from these kind of like facsimile spaces to like something more imaginative and more kind of springing from the imagination of the kids themselves, which is very, very cool. That feels very real to me as well. Not as real as just like, hey, there's a goose, but I mean real in the sense that like that kind of feels like how you would play as a kid, right?
But I think often these things, they sort of mirror the development process as well, where you're sitting there with a bunch of assets and you're kind of the kid going, you know, well, what can we do with this? You know, we're like, you know, me and Moo are like sitting around like a pair of kids with He-Man figures, and we're just like, well, we've got all these models, what should we do? You know, where you do just start like putting combinations together, and you know, it's not so different than when you're a kid and you just tip out a box of toys and just start making up stories between them all.
I do, yeah. I don't know. There's an aspect of it that I really enjoy. I think of at the end, with whose father is it? I think it's Demelza's father who's there, and just this idea of recounting these adventures. You know, like I don't know. There's an aspect of this game that feels very, very genuine, to me in a way that I very much enjoy. And the idea that there's playfulness that exists on the part of the characters, but then also, like you're saying, playfulness that's reflected on your part as creators is very fun. I feel like sometimes the creative process feels just like a thing you go through, but here it feels very much present in the game in a way, kind of like you're suggesting, that reflects some of the process that you might have had as developers as well.
Cool.
I don't know. I do want to ask then, you know, I think, you know, Rex, you have such kind of distinct kind of like this background coming from Media Molecule and the art that you do. How often, like, what was the process for both of you figuring out how this game looks? Because I feel like it's such a distinct, like very cool looking game. Has that nice kind of sketched, drawn feel. How do you go through an art process like that?
Well, I think the important first step is just being a little bit realistic. You know, we knew that there were only going to be two of us most of the time. And, you know, so it probably wasn't going to be a 3D game.
Right.
But also we wanted that feeling of exploration. And if it was just purely 2D, then you wouldn't be able to like properly explore. I mean, it's cool to be able to go left and right, but it feels like as a kid you want to be, especially if you've got a bike in the game, you know, you don't want to be just like, I'm going to go on my bike and I've got total freedom to go forwards. You know, you want to go left, right, up, down, tear into those bushes, like, you know, go all the places you're not supposed to go, just have freedom. So right from the start it was going to be a 3D world but populated entirely with 2D assets, to give that feeling of freedom, but also like not be possible with such a tiny team. So that was, that set a very set the goal really for the overall look of how it was going to be like authored. But then for the actual style, that really came from trying to make the game look a little like the kids, like you're seeing it through the kids' eyes themselves. It's all of the locations are based on real places, and I think it hopefully has a sense of those, that sense of place of these are real places. There are people are dealing with hardships. It's not just like this like deliriously happy made up video game world. It's kind of based on real places with real stuff going on behind the scenes, but it's all seen through kids' eyes, so it's a little bit exaggerated in certain ways, in the way that kids will exaggerate. When they're drawing, they'll focus on the things that are important to them, but also with the like hand-drawn style, it meant that by creating, like by visualizing the world using kind of like chalk and pastels and coloring pencils, it looked like their take on reality, if that makes sense. So it's like a little bit like they have already played the game, and like that they've presented this this document. It's like here's what I did over the summer holidays kind of thing. And that also meant that it could, by doing it in those materials, it felt that it needed to have like a stop motion look, so that it could kind of wobble and jiggle around, so that it did look more like the kind of energetic like drawings and emotions that you would get from kids. I'm sort of like waffling a lot here, but the important thing is just to try and get this kind of visual depiction of how kids see the world, and like overlay that onto the landscape, and also like juxtapose that a little bit with the fact that adults are clearly not seeing the world like this. So and it although it came along later, it opened up the possibilities of us adding on to the environments. So things could like warp and change depending on if they're busting into like some scrap metal yard and it's kind of heavily protected, then they start to see it like a castle. It meant that we weren't just having a very realistic depiction of the world and then we couldn't go anywhere with that. It having this style meant that we could just start pushing all the time of like, the kids are, you're actually getting to see it as they're seeing it, and sometimes that becomes more vivid and sometimes it fades away a little more.
I think that the chalk thing you mentioned comes across very clearly in some moments, like when they're charging and they have the like joust spears, but they kind of are in that kind of chalk style, right? Because it's kind of a make-believe moment, right? I think there are moments where those things I kind of like you're saying about the world being from their perspective. I think there are moments too where you can see the make-believe very clearly, based upon kind of how each thing looks. So that's always been kind of interesting to me, the lines where you can see like the world behind like the actual world, and then also the times where it almost feels like there's drawing on top of it, right? Which I think is very, very cool.
Yeah, and it's, there's all sorts of things you can do that are fun, like just the way that like the kids' scale changes in levels depending on like how confident they feel. So when they're in like the local harbour town where they sort of feel like, oh well, we're the kind of kings of this it's a very well known area to them. So they're like as big as adults when they're in that section.
Right.
But when they're like busting into like the most densest forests at the very far end of the island where there's all these cliffs and stuff like that, the kids are like way smaller in comparison. And it's fun. Like, video games are a fun medium that you can do all of these sort of things. I mean, if you put a movie out and you did that, everyone would be like, what? But I mean, obviously,
you could try.
It's classic stuff in cinematography to, like, change the camera angles and stuff to get these kind of feelings anyway. But you can just take things a lot further in games because every single pixel, every single sound, none of it exists. We just had to make it all up. So it's, you've got license to mess around a lot more.
I think on the end of the spectrum of imaginary and like actual, I think one of the more actual parts of the game is getting to customize your bike, right? That's kind of very tactile in a way that you really get to adjust and bring in new parts. How early did either of you know that was something that you really wanted to do?
I mean, the irony is that's like one of the last things we put in, but it was one of the
Right.
first things that we knew we needed to have.
Cool.
Just because I think, as kids, like, your bike is a very key part of your expression, of your identity, of who you are, of what your taste is, whatever it may be at that age. But yeah, I think one of the two ideas that sort of came together were the idea of loot collection, where, I think a lot of games would have a proper currency and a proper shop where you'd be buying, things that are priced reasonably. And we just wanted to make sure that, like, I don't think kids, especially when I was growing up, I didn't think about money that way, so what was important to me were just random things that I would collect, and, it was just subjective to me what was valuable and what wasn't. And so we wanted to mesh sort of that idea of kids just valuing random things, whether they're owl pellets or baseball cards or action figure heads or whatever, with the adult world. And we just wanted to have some kind of interesting interaction there of, like, the shopkeeper who's sort of in that weird state where he's just like, I like, this doesn't buy anything, but, like, these kids kind of could use these bike things. So it sort of gave us the excuse to let the kids just collect garbage for loot, but still use that as a vector to express themselves and make decisions. And it's, it's really nice because, as well as, kids expressing themselves through that, it obviously gives the player an opportunity to express themselves through this, and sort of to go back to that childhood experience of, decking out your bike and, putting cards in the spokes and listening to what sounds it makes or that kind of thing.
I think there's cool moments in any game, right, where you have this opportunity to kind of value expression over, I don't know, like raw mechanical advantage or anything. I could see versions. I mean, there's I don't know, racing games where it's a lot of like optimization, right? Where it's a lot of make sure you have the best thing, make sure you found the hidden card to put in the spoke of your wheels so that you can move faster and do XYZ thing or whatever. I think in Knights and Bikes it's really expressive. And does tie into that idea of just putting stuff that you, like, kind of like you're saying, that you find on your bike. I mean, I use the card example because that's the one that I think a lot of people kind of did as kids, right? It was like put the card in the spoke of their wheel so it makes that little flappy sound, which is always, well, whoever's doing that's like a real tough biker.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a kid you're imagining that is making it go faster, and
yeah, right.
So we're not necessarily, we're not sort of actually making the bike go twice as fast, but it makes a cool sound that makes you feel like you're going twice as fast. So that's the thing, like you were saying. I mean, it's not like we're making the Gran Turismo of bikes
of
with
bikes
like training wheels
yeah.
on them and stuff, but it's just trying to represent that total joy and affection that everyone has for their bikes. Because I mean, we latched onto bikes because we both remembered and have heard so many other people's stories of like how your bike is your first independence from the rest of your family, and
right.
It's like that little it's like an early coming of age moment where you can like escape and go off and do stuff, and that was the real feeling we wanted to get in the game of like you're kind of bored at home, and then things start to expand out, and really the catalyst for that is jumping on your bike.
Right, it just gives you that way to get a little further away from where you were, right? As opposed to walking down the street, now you can go up and about through the countryside or whatever. I remember, like for me, it was weirder because I grew up in a small city, so I mean it's like go up a couple blocks maybe, but the idea, and I think in Goonies and you see that in Knights Bikes too, is that there's just like so much that you can kind of reach once you have, kind of like you're saying, that vehicle, that independence, which is cool. Checking something. There we go. Actually, moving on to a completely different topic, which isn't quite independence. It's the opposite, in fact. I'd be curious to know how you both got involved with Double Fine Presents, how that became a publisher thing, right? How you ended up working with us.
I think at least for me, we've always had quite a good relationship. Both of us individually had good relationships with people at Double Fine.
Right.
I knew Tim from before I moved out to the UK. And so, for example, when we launched our Kickstarter campaign, we sent it over to Double Fine before we launched it to get advice, and because obviously
cool.
they've been through it before, and they gave us a lot of feedback and that kind of thing. I believe Spaff was already there at the time, so obviously we had the connection through Spaff as well. But yeah, I think we always had a really good relationship with Double Fine and Double Fine people, even in the early days before the Kickstarter campaign. So I think it was sort of a really natural fit. And I think, we see the games that Double Fine is making, and they're all about creating these worlds and exploring them. And I think, one of the games that most commonly people refer to when they see Knights and Bikes is Costume Quest. It's one of, these other games that has a theme about children and their imagination, set in the autumn, and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it really made a lot of sense for us anyway, because the audience that plays games that Double Fine makes, we thought would really, really enjoy the kind of thing that we had in mind.
Yeah, I guess I should be thinking about Costume Quest right now, because it's that time of year, which means that 9,000 people are going to ask me if we're making Costume Quest 3, which that's part of my life. I can see that comparison, right? In terms of that game in particular, and the way that it's about really exploring a space through the eyes of kids. The imagination mostly comes out in that game through the battles, right? Through the costumes. Whereas in Knights and Bikes, it's kind of written more directly upon the world. But I can see that crossover. And yeah, I guess you both probably would have known Spaff, right? I'm sure that helped.
Yep.
That man.
Yeah,
That's strange.
I actually
That's
think
strange man.
the first time, I think when we pitched, I think Greg was staying at Rex's for a London indie game event, and I was working at Rex's, and I was like, "Hey, Greg." So yeah, I think we were, personally very close to Double Fine already.
I can see that. I think for me, right, as somebody who's not been around very long, it's like it's always curious to know where those connections are, and I think it's cool to hear about maybe sharing stuff of the Kickstarter beforehand, because I think I worked on one game that was a Kickstarter project, and those I feel like those campaigns, you feel like you account for everything, and then more stuff happens than
Yep.
you could ever plan for. Like for us, I was working on a game called Boot Hill Heroes, and it was just a Kickstarter campaign to get money for our composer, quite frankly, and that led to, oh crap, now there's a crap, but in a cool way, right? Of like, now there's going to be a new town. Oh wow, this thing keeps on going, and like, how do we plan for those things, and how do we deal with the reality of what it means to make a game that has backers? It's a really unique situation. So I think getting feedback from people who've gone through that is like so essential, especially nowadays, because I feel like Kickstarters are even more particular a process now than they were maybe even when they were really first happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really, as you said, like when you run the actual campaign, it's a nightmare in many ways because it's constantly changing and you're learning things. But I mean, I'm so glad we did it. I mean, one of the great side effects of doing the Kickstarter campaign is that we had to, but we actually really enjoy doing the monthly backer updates. And
Yeah.
I think when you're just two people just, chugging along on a game, it's really easy to lose sight of how much progress you're making every month and all the new features and all the new assets. And it was always a really nice thing to be able to every month, for the first of the month, sit down. I'd go back through my revision history in SVN and be like, what did I actually do this month? And to be able to, share the details of the experience, but also just to like, acknowledge and appreciate how much work everyone's been doing on the game. But also our backers are just like, they've been so supportive at every twist and turn. I think every step along the way, as long as we've kept them, informed, they've always been happy with changes that we're making or all the decisions we've made along the way. And then on top of that, I think it's always nice to have a community that is bought in. I think a lot of the times you like,
absolutely,
yeah, you announce something on Twitter and you get so much hate, and it's so hard to know, like, is this hate coming from people that would love it but we're not delivering on the idea, or is it people that would hate us no matter what and are just being horrible people?
It creates like a split, right? It's that feeling of I think there is when you have a Kickstarter, or I think now for Psychonauts 2, right? We did a little bit of that through Fig, which I'm just catching up and kind of getting our campaign stuff rolling again for more updates now, because that's my job. There's that split between like the cold worry that you feel about having obligations to people, right? But also, like you're saying, the feeling of assurance and kind of security that it can bring to know that there are people who just saw that game and knew that the thing you wanted to make, the thing that was like in your heart and you got to put out there, is actually a thing that they're excited to play. It's really, really cool. I'm checking to see if people are asking questions, because one of the things that people can do in the chat, I've been looking at the chat, is that they can ask questions. I think one person was asking a bit of a broad question, but I think this could lead to a couple of interesting places, which is, what was the most difficult thing to create for Knights and Bikes? Was there a process, an area, a system, or anything like that you particularly iterated upon in a lot of ways?
I would probably say the bikes.
The bikes.
Yeah. And unfortunately, they were in the title of the game, so we couldn't drop them, I mean, we don't have a huge amount of knights either, but yeah, it would feel very bad if we didn't have any bikes in the game. But yeah, I mean, it was just quite a tricky process to get a 2D bike feeling. I mean, the feel was really good, like really early on. Like Moo did a great job on that. But also making sure that visually, having a bike that was like spinning around in like 32 directions or however many, was like looking good. When it was still 2D, there's a lot of drawings, a lot of animation stuff to figure out, and then also you've got the fact that the front axle, steering column, that can steer independently as well, so you have to make all of the animations for that. And,
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
yeah. So
That is how bikes work. You're right.
Yeah, and then the wheels are turning as well. I mean, oh my god, what a nightmare!
Oh gosh. Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of tricky. I mean, there were times where I was just like, we need to just put a 3D bike in this game, but but then you've got the problem of like, well, do we then have to make a 3D character to sit on the bike? And
Right.
you know, you basically started the game from scratch again. So we didn't do that. But I mean, luckily, because one of the nice things about the kind of sketchy visual style is that sometimes you can get away with some quite sketchy visual things happening as well. So
Yeah, of course.
it's always a little rougher around the edges, but I think the main thing was just to really convey the like wild abandonment of the kids, and it was really fun like animating Nessa and Demelza, who have quite different personalities when they're on the bikes, and just really focusing in on like their facial features while they're cycling, and not worrying quite so much about like every tiny detail of the bike. So like when Demelza is cycling, she like almost immediately goes into like a coasting mode where she's just like, her head is back, her eyes are closed, you know, she doesn't care where she's like, if she's going to hit anything, she's just having a great time, and her mouth is like wide open, and her red curly hair is all like spilling out behind. And then Nessa, being the like cooler kid, she like stands up on the pedals, you know, she's like, you know, properly leaning into the like, you know, charging ahead. So they, you know, their personalities come out in the way that they sit on the bikes. But yeah, I think probably the bikes, for me at least, were the hardest feature. And just a whole entire world to build.
Oh, that's true. But was there anything particular that you wanted to call attention to, Moo?
Yeah, I mean, it was just the combinatorial explosion of making a game that can be played like either local co-op or single player with AI, either character being AI, or online co-op. And like the workflow I think we always had is like, for the most part, I just wanted Rex to create freely. And so what we would usually do is Rex would like do like a quick layout of levels, and like each puzzle would sort of work independently in each little section, but then I would have to go back and like connect them all up, and then like add the AI for each of the two characters, and then that add online support for each one. And so I think just having so many different features, and for every single feature I had to program it like 4 times basically, once for local co-op, once for Demelza AI, once for Nessa AI, and once for online. And I think also because it's so easy to change stuff in Unity, like we'd always be like, oh, you know, this half of this level is completely changed. I'm like, oh, I need to redo like 4 more of those levels and that kind of thing. So I think, yeah, just the combinatorial aspect of all that kind of stuff. And then now, you know, that we're past most of it, like making sure all of those things work on all the platforms is also like has been madness.
Right, because you've been dealing with Nintendo Switch now, and a bunch of different platforms.
Yeah, and even like on PC, we decided, because the backers, you know, were really keen about having a DRM free version. So I was like, oh, I'll do like Good Old Games, and I didn't realize that Good Old Games has like a totally different, like, you know, implementing online co-op there was like a whole other thing, and so having 2 PC platforms, and then, or 2 PC storefronts, and then Windows, Mac, Linux on each one, and then PS4, and then Switch, and it's just been quite a lot of things.
I can't. I remember when we had to, for our stuff, we had to do it for Microsoft, which meant they required us to write in C#, and then we had to do for PlayStation Mobile, which was like such a very unique, weird platform with its own restrictions, right? Like PlayStation Mobile, it's not even a thing anymore,
Nope.
right? So those are always challenges too. Those are like the nitty gritty, real hardcore challenges I feel sometimes. looking at our questions. It's funny that not funny. I mean, obviously you would mention your main characters, but some people are asking if there were any inspirations behind Nessa or Demelza, folks that you base them off of, or things like that.
I
Maybe
mean,
not, right?
yeah, I mean, Demelza was like, I mean, I went to a tiny school. I think it was just the local village school, and there were 20 of us in the school. And of those 20, I think 5 girls were called Demelza. So, you know, it was a very popular name at the time. It's like a Cornish name, but I think it's because there was this show in the late 70s called Poldark, which came back again recently, and the leading lady in that was called Demelza. So I think everyone in Cornwall, like, you know, they were like, oh, there's a show about our local area, we're going to call our firstborn after the you know, the sort of heroine of this TV series. So there
is
were
a Demelza Poldark and Ross Venner Poldark I'm looking at right now.
Okay.
Interesting names from these fellows.
Yeah. So they remade Poldark. I don't know if it's like a big thing in the States, but it's pretty big in the UK. The remake that came out quite recently. And
I'm looking at this. This was 2015 to 2019 BBC adaptation. That's fascinating. That's really cool.
I think a lot of people just watch it for the main guy, Poldark, and he takes his shirt off a lot, and you know he's kind of, you know, got all the bits that everyone wants to see. So
of course.
I'm trying to think of any other. I mean, not massively. I mean, we had like we were saying earlier, we had a larger group of kids. There was like another kid who was like more of a nature kind of themed character who would be like really good at tracking, and he had like this big coat that had all these animals living inside it, and his hat was like one of those like Davy Crockett hats, except that it was but it was an actual animal. So every now and then, like, you'd see some eyes like open and appear and look around. But we didn't actually use him, and I think we probably just focused in on Demelza and Nessa because Demelza really represents like a local character, who's very like who's just soaked up all of the legends and the stories, and is very much like made out of where she's grown up. And then Nessa is a character who's the complete opposite, in all kinds of different ways, in personality, in where she's grown up, like her life experiences, and they would be able to like really play off each other, and they felt like the least like stereotypical characters. You know, we were worried that we didn't go down the route of making the kind of Goonies game where you've got the geek and the sports jock and the, you know, so on. Because it felt like those sort of characters, not only are they stereotypes and not as interesting, they also, like, gameplay wise, they just became like tools. You know, they weren't, you didn't really think about them and the relationships with the other characters. They were just like, well, he's the one that can hack computers, and he's the one that can open doors, and he's the one that is like able to breathe underwater, and, you know, all of this kind of stuff. So we just wanted to get away from any of that kind of like super gamey but like not very realistic characterization.
Right. You want them to feel like real folk with some care and attention. Yeah. Which is always good. And I think, you know, honing it into those two characters gives you a chance to really focus on obviously just one relationship, right? Which has to be so much better from a writing perspective in terms of not having to, I mean, even just like in terms of like complexity, right? Of just like having to account for so many different things. You can really focus on these two really awesome kids.
Yeah. Well, and also with it being like a co-op game, you know, it's kind of weird to if you play it with another friend, you are both playing one of those characters, and your friendship, like outside of the game, is hopefully being mirrored somehow, in some way inside the game. But if you had like 3 or 4 characters, then they're not representing you anymore. You're just like, switching between them.
Yeah, you're just choosing.
Yeah. You're
character
like,
skin or something.
use Demelza on the thing, rather than just like, you go
Right.
over there and do that thing for me.
Yeah, I can see that. That makes some sense. Some people are asking a slightly different question, which is kind of how the books came about, because you have 3 books now that have been based off this game, written by Gabrielle Kent. Some people are asking how that process came about. Did y'all write the games first, and then obviously that partnership comes in? Like, how does that whole process work? I think a lot of people are interested in terms of how do you get involved? Like, how does something like that happen, and how do you approach a project like that, which is maybe telling your story for an audience that might be a little bit different than the one that your game. I mean, not entirely, but right, but like might be a little bit different than the one that's coming to play your game.
Should I take that one?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a little bit like the Double Fine publishing situation. It came down. Quite a lot of it would just like, existing relationships and
Yes.
talking about things. The one of the publishers of that book I talked to about maybe doing a book of a previous project, and that hadn't worked out, and we kept in touch, and then as soon as we put the Kickstarter up, he was a very enthusiastic backer, and wanted to get involved and talk to us about potentially doing a book, and it went very quiet for a few years, and we all had different. I mean, we were just heads down trying to build the game that we'd promised. So, but then it started bubbling up again, and he had worked with Gabrielle before. She'd previously written a series of another trilogy called Alfie Bloom, and that kind of I'd known her socially as well, so all of these things just started to join together. It was kind of interesting because of like the plan was that the book number 1 would come out probably after the game, and then there would be 2 more, and I think because of games being a little more difficult to predict in their timescales, I think the 3rd book is the only one that came out after the game. There were like actually 2 books before the game came out.
Yeah.
But Gabrielle we kept her in the loop about what was going on in the game and gave her as much information that we could. The first book is more similar to the game, not totally the same, but it's kind of a similar overall story. I mean, not we weren't like limiting that, but that we kind of had a plan to tell a similar-ish story, which worked out really great. And then what was really nice is that then she'd soaked up this world so much that she was able to then write 2 more books that like just keep expanding the universe out. So lots of new locations, lots of new characters, and it's been really fun for us because we get to find out what like our characters are up to. It's kind of like it's like they've gone off to college and they're like sending us like letters back of like, oh, you won't believe what happened now, and we get to hear about all these things that they've got up to now, and without having to write or animate or code or do all of that kind of stuff as well. So it's kind of the purest form of of the characters and their stories. That it's really fun to be able to read them rather than have to worry about how to turn them into some video game.
Does it ever feel? This probably isn't the right word, but it's what I'll use. Does it ever feel kind of scary to kind of entrust that to someone else? Do you, or is it just pure excitement the entire time?
No, I think I mean, I think if you know who you're working with, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's probably a lot scarier if someone had approached us and said, we want the rights, and we will give you some money, and that would be exciting. It might mean that we could pay ourselves or something, but it would also be kind of scary because you would just be handing it off.
Right.
It's kind of like when you do those licensing deals, and you've got this cool mascot, and you sign a deal with someone.
Yeah.
And then 6 months later, you see the most malformed version of your character turning up on the internet that people are finding in bargain basement bins and stuff.
Selling Coca-Cola or
yeah,
something.
Exactly. And I think that's the scary stuff because you just don't have any control over it.
Right.
Whereas for us, we had a really good relationship with the publisher who were called Knights of.
Yeah.
And they would keep us in the loop, and we would get edits, and we'd be able to give feedback and what have you. But we really tried to be fairly hands off so that it could be its own thing, and it wasn't. We weren't trying too hard to make everything exactly the same. And sometimes we get messages from people go, oh, but this character is called that in the book and they're called that in the game, and it's just well, I'd like to think of it as it's kind of like Nessa and Demelza just being like kids, where they misremember things and they're just excited about the stories that they're telling, and sometimes you have one version of the truth and sometimes you have the other. They don't have to all perfectly match up all of the time.
I think it's cool. I think it's one of the things I've enjoyed with some of my favorite games or other kind of properties that I really like or whatever, is getting to experience those stories in different forms. So I have an RPG I love. It's called Skies of Arcadia, but a long time ago there were audio dramas and things like that. And I think any chance to engage with a world, not just in games, but through books, through anything else, is really, really cool. And I kind of wish, I know there's lots of practical reasons why it doesn't happen, but I kind of wish that happened a little bit more often, right? To allow, because I think a lot of games are so imaginative. I think Knights and Bikes has such a kind of infectious style to it that seeing it expand feels natural, right? When I see those book covers, I'm like, oh well, of course, right? It just feels like such a great fit.
Well, I think it's really fun to just make the most of the medium that you're in, and then see how see that same thing in a different medium, taking advantage of that. For instance, in the game version, like I was saying earlier about the whole imagination thing, where the world changes and you see that overlay onto the landscape. That's a very, very video gamey thing,
video game. Yeah.
And that, I think that works really well in the game. And that's not really an element that's necessarily really in the books, because the books are, they're having these adventures, and they're fighting off goblins, and they're meeting ancient undead queens and kings and what have you.
Yes.
And they're very much in the moment, because it would be weird to be reading a book where it's all the time going, oh, but is it wink wink,
you can't shift it around quite as much.
You just want to be ripping through the pages, finding out about their adventures. You don't want to be having this weird unless you had like a perspex layer of, you know, an extra page on top of a page, so that you think you're seeing one thing and then you turn it and it's, you know, something different underneath. But you know, I think that might have pushed the price of the book up a bit. You know, so yeah, it's just kind of interesting to just make the most of the medium that you're working in. Yeah, it's kind of fun.
Always good. I think somebody's typing out a question. I don't know what it is. I'm going to tell people in chat right now, if you have any last questions that you want to get in, now would be the time, because I don't want to keep y'all too much longer. I think this has been pretty chill, but I also know you're on vacation. and Moo, your kid's probably busting down the door, fighting.
Yeah, I think he's trying to eat now. So
Let's see if folks can type out their questions very quickly. We'll do them, and then if either of you need to run off while these are being answered, that's fine. We'll kind of ramp it down slowly here and keep it pretty casual. Somebody is asking if there were any times where you wanted to make more specific references within the games, either to like the Goonies or like that sort of original 80s setting, and whether or not you backed off on that sort of stuff because you thought it would maybe go over players' heads or things like that.
I think something that was important to us is to like not go like too pastiche in the 80s thing, because there's a lot of other, you know, there's a lot of other games and movies and TV shows. There's that one that came along while we were making this game called Stranger Things, that, you know,
Stranger Things
people went pretty crazy for, and it's, you know, it's cool, but you know, that is kind of a greatest hits of 80s references.
Yeah.
And it felt that we had these characters in this location that were a little more maybe unusual, and you know, maybe it's because of Little Big Planet being such like a pop culture mashup, but ever since then I've sort of tried to not go too pop culture-y. Maybe go back to it one day, but I think it's more fun to come up with your own world than make just, you know, too much of a collection of references and like in jokes and, you know, nods to like other material and media.
Yeah. I think it makes it feel like its own thing. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it can take you out of the experience, I think, sometimes. I think, you know, it can work better, say, in a book where it's just something can just be mentioned as like, you know, and, you know, they threw down their Skeletor or something, and it's not like, that's not a big deal. But I feel, I don't know, sometimes in a game where you're actually seeing that, you know, you have to see the representation of those things as well. You're not just reading about Skeletor, you know, there has to be an actual Skeletor there. So yeah, just it feels more jarring maybe in games.
Yeah. I would guess too that having it be its own thing means that when the time does come for somebody to turn it into a book, whether or not you're talking to people about a cartoon or something like that, I think that gives people a chance to just engage with the thing and not need to worry about the reference points or touchstones, right? They can just focus on that thing.
Yeah, and also it means that, you know, you don't suddenly then have to try and license a whole bunch of things because, you know, you threw them into this one thing, and now the property is like blown up, and, you know, they want to make a movie, and you're like, oh, but we put loads of references to that thing in it, and oh dear.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
I can see that entirely.
Yeah, we even went with the non-branded flying disc rather than naming it the
Frisbee.
thing.
Yeah. Well, we can say it here. Don't worry about that.
Frisbee.
Oh, they're shutting down the Discord. That's such a bummer. I think maybe we'll call quits there. That sounds very mean. Call quits. I think we'll wrap it down here. This was great. I think I've been trying to get this conversation happening for a little while now, because I think for me especially, a thing that attracted me to Double Fine, and although we're sort of slowing it down, was Double Fine Presents, and getting to obviously not just be where I was in a studio full of cool people, but get to talk to other folks who are making their own things. I think Nikes and Bikes, I said that funny. I think it's such a distinct game, right? That getting a chance to finally talk with both of you and not just worry about Switch cert or things like that is very nice. It's very, very cool. So I appreciate this very, very much.
Cool. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's been super nice. Yeah.
Yes. So I think we're going to kind of go, and I'll see about maybe sharing a few game codes or something inside chat too to celebrate this arrival here. And then hopefully we'll see more Knights and Bike stuff in the future, although I know the future can be full of anything and everything. So I'm really excited to see what happens next. Cool. So I am going to actually hit stop on Audacity for me, which you both can do now too.
Oh, okay. Yeah.